So at this point, I'd like to invite Art McDonald to offer our opening prayer. And he is online, I believe.
So, folks, a minister friend of mine, um, after reading the Ten Commandments, decided that he would add 10 more suggestions to the Ten Commandments. And here they are. His name is Dick Gilbert. Thou shalt not give into irresponsible despair, for to despair is to yield for self-fulfilling prophecy. Thou wilt need both perspective and passion, the informed heart, if thou wouldest change the world. Number 2, thou shalt remember that while many are called, most are frozen. 3, thou shalt be a fulcrum with which to change the world. 4, thou shalt carry a newspaper in one hand and a Bible in the other. 5, thou shalt resist burnout and invest thyself for the long haul, even to the day of thy death. 6, thou shalt be up to thy steeples in politics, for it is in the political halls and marketplaces that human destiny is being decided. 7, thou shalt do thy homework. Blessed and effective are the informed. 8, thou shalt think globally and act locally. Thou shalt see the details of thy work in the larger context of meaning and action, and resolve to do thine own part as well. 9, thou shalt change the world one step at a time. Thou must live in the tension between Martin Luther King's fierce urgency of now and the sure knowledge that peace and justice are a long time coming. And 10th, thou shalt be a happy warrior, for the work of justice is a joyful obligation. Keep thy sense of humor, for it shall be needed, and celebrate life in all thy going and coming, in yea, from this day forth. Amen.
Amen. Okay, and now Mary Troutman will introduce our speaker.
Let's see that's the in-person.
Now that I have your attention, I thought long and hard about this. Well, how do you introduce someone who needs no introduction? Someone like Conor Lamb. Anybody who lives in the Pittsburgh area knows the name Lamb. It's part of a political dynasty. But there's more. Besides holding public office in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., Conor Lamb also was a Marine officer and a federal prosecutor. In Congress, he served on the committees of Science, Space and Technology, Veterans Affairs, Transportation, and Infrastructure. Prior to that role, he served as an assistant U.S. attorney in the city of Pittsburgh. Today, Conor Lamb is a distinguished lecturer of law at Duquesne University Law School, where he teaches a course in faith and democracy. That's how much there is, a whole course. When I was thinking about this, I asked around for stories, and I got a really nice one from Peggy Amatangelo. And this is in her own words. My late husband, Vince Amatangelo, a mechanical aeronautical engineer, and I took an Osher course through Carnegie Mellon University, a course on the locks and dams. Having water skied on our rivers, we had experienced using the locks and dams and were well aware of their importance. Our classes met with the Coast Guard, the River Patrol, barge engineers, and learned the importance of the rivers that take traffic off the highways. We invited newly elected Congressman Conor Lamb to a meeting with some of the class participants. Remember that? Conor Lamb told us that his grandfather, Tom Lamb, a former senator had told Conor when he was 8 years old that if we did not address the infrastructure at that time, his grandson would still be dealing with it at a greater cost. Conor said, and here I am. Conor was well aware of the financial need to support our waterways, and we were elated that he was willing to support that effort, the infrastructure. And by the way, if you saw the articles in the Post-Gazette over the weekend, Friday and Saturday, about the ice on the rivers and all the other problems, and they did specifically make mention of the traffic that the rivers take off the highways and don't require nearly the amount of maintenance that the highways do. Peggy and Vince Amatangelo and Jim McCarville were among his influencers. Peggy and Jim are here tonight. With regard to his earlier years, Conor was very well educated, having gone to grade school at St. Bernard's, where I'm sure he fell under the influence of the Sisters of St. Joseph. High school at Central Catholic, where he was under the influence of the Christian Brothers. He got his JD at the University of Pennsylvania. And even the Sisters of Divine Providence have a slight connection in his life because his wife is the niece of one of our sisters. Conor will speak to us about faith and democracy. So we welcome Conor Lamb.
Thank you. Thank you so much. God, I used to talk so much about those stupid locks and dams all the time. And I'd come home from things and my wife would say, oh, what was it? Another speech about the locks and dams. And I'd start to say no, and she goes, oh yeah, Medicare. Like those are my big, yeah, I knew my district. So hopefully I can give you all something a little more stimulating tonight. I want to thank this group so much for inviting me. I'm going to put my timer on here just to make sure I'm playing by the rules. But I've been following the speakers that this group attracts for a while. To think that I am speaking in the same forum as Cardinal Radcliffe is a huge honor and a thrill to me. So thank you for having me here. And for all the people who are new on the Zoom or even here in the Kearns Center, I really encourage you to follow the Association of Pittsburgh Priests and the program that they put on. What I'm going to talk about tonight is a course I developed at Duquesne Law School in the last couple of years that is called Faith and Democracy. I normally stress about how I'm going to fit everything into 13 weeks, so fitting it into 40 minutes is even tougher than that. It's the first time I've ever tried to do it in this format, so if I'm sprinting or kind of running past obscure references, just go easy on me there. I'm also going to try, for the first time, the challenge I set for myself is that with my students, we'll spend 13 weeks reading all these things and talking about them, and the final exam is usually some version of, take all this and kind of run it through the filter of your own life and tell me what your faith tells you about democracy and where we're going, and be in dialogue with all the writers that we've read. And they really struggle with that prompt. They want to write you a book report on each person that we've read. And I just kind of keep going back to them. No, you have to think about this, what this means for you. What are you going to do with your life? And I sort of laugh at them sometimes at the end. I'm saying, guys, it's not that hard. Don't overthink it. 20 single-spaced pages later, it actually is that hard. It's pretty tough. This is the first time I've ever tried to answer my own prompt. So we'll see where it goes. But I think that experience of teaching has taught me that if you care about where our democracy is and where it might be going, if you're trying to bring your faith to that conversation, it is not a conversation we can really have at the 10,000-foot level for a lot of reasons, one of which is the whole intellectual structure of our society is breaking down. People are not reading. The concepts are totally different. And we have to meet people where they are. We have to talk about our own lives. There's a parable that some of you have probably heard before about the the Catholic bishop that was addressing a bunch of new seminarians who were going out to some far frontier to take up new parishes, among people who hadn't been exposed to the Gospels before, and they were all stressed about which passages they were going to preach and which texts they were going to use and would people understand them. And the bishop just kind of laughed and said, the only gospel you have to worry about is the gospel of your own life, because that's the only one that these people are going to read and try to understand. And I think there's a tendency in our culture right now, I experience this a lot, both really in religion and in politics. People are drawing themselves ever more inward. There's kind of a fortress mentality, and people want to be around people who think and talk like them. They like those priests. They want to have certain approved texts with approved meanings. And we assume that there are all these people outside of our circle that just don't understand and can't be spoken to. And I think about this. I don't know if anyone knows this painting, but that is St. Paul preaching of all places at the Areopagus in Athens. And it's, I think someone who's more of a scripture person in here could confirm for me, but I think this is the only time in scripture that a Christian is attempting to preach to people with no knowledge whatsoever of anything that's in the scriptures. Obviously St. Paul's traveling all around, but most of the people who he's speaking to have at least a Jewish background. Here in Greece, he's speaking to people for whom monotheism isn't even a concept, much less the finer points of Christianity and a Messiah and a resurrection. And this is actually the account of this in Acts is very funny, kind of to me at least, the way it's written. He starts off, he finds these Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, I guess, in the forum, wherever this is. He starts talking to them. And it actually says this in the Bible, the way they react to them is, what does this babbler have to say? That's their question. And what he says is, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. I used to do things like go to gun shows in Washington County and a Rotary Club in Greene County, and these places that just make me relate to this. Like you're just reaching out and you need some symbol to establish a common ground. And it's a powerful thing that he does, and it creates, I think, the possibility of a connection between him and someone else. And if there's one thing that to me just kind of runs like a thread through the work I've tried to do with these students at Duquesne, it's a choice, it's a religious choice, it's a personal choice about whether you're going to turn outward or fold yourself inward. And there's a lot of pressure in our culture right now toward kind of this movement inward, and the movement outward is scary and it's risky, and it seems a little bit more fraught than it used to be. But this is kind of the inspiration for one of the things that I want to say. When he gives that speech, the last thing I'm going to say about it is, if you've ever heard that beautiful line that sometimes people use about God, within whom we move and breathe and have our being, that comes from this speech. That's where that comes from in Scripture, because what he was trying to say is he's surrounded by these altars and these shrines to all the different gods, and he finds the one to an unknown God. And what he's really trying to say is God doesn't live in any of these things. It's something that's all around us. And I was thinking about that because as a lawyer, as a technical person, as someone that was in the halls of Congress, you start to think about democracy like it's the words that are written on the paper, or, we use this term, the framers, to talk about the people that founded America as if they framed a house or a structure. But I don't think that's really what democracy is. I don't think it lives in those documents or in the building so much. I think it lives in all of us to the extent that it lives at all. And I want to get people talking about that. So let's also be clear. The other thing that Professor Lamb here is not going to do tonight is there's this thing, especially this year for whatever reason, where people that want to bring faith into politics, politicians, it's kind of this simple tit for tat. I believe in position X and my religion tells me so, and then there will be like a Twitter exchange of relevant Bible verses, and you see which way it shakes out, and you're in the same place at the end that you were at the beginning. It doesn't really take you anywhere. That is not what I'm trying to do, which is not to say that there are not a million reasons that all of us probably want to do that all the time, and individual issues that our faith should be kind of giving us the courage to stand up with and engage in. How could you not notice that the 5-year-old that was arrested in Minneapolis and flown to Texas and separated from his parents and all that, how could you not notice that at that same age, Jesus was hiding in Egypt from King Herod? How could you not notice that and want to take action on behalf of that? There's 100 things that we could talk about just like that from the last few months, and you should, and you're all part of other groups probably where you do that. The thing that made me want to teach a whole class and think about this so much is, like, how did we become a country where that was even possible? It feels to me like we became a country where that was possible very quickly. It's not to say there haven't been injustices throughout our whole history. Of course there have. But it's just hard for me to picture that happening even 10 or 15 years ago, at least the way that it is happening these days. I mean, Trump standing in Lafayette Square with the upside-down Bible is an image that I think of a lot. A president never would have done something like that before. And so this is all downstream of things that are happening in our whole culture, using democracy in that broad sense in our whole society. And if we can try to get at that, if you imagine the enormous number of people in this country who call themselves Christian, if that was on their agenda, not the particular issue of abortion and immigration and poverty, all important things, but if it was, if we all took a moment as Christians to appreciate that it's the democracy itself that allows us to live this way, that allows us to believe what we believe and profess it, and you can start to ask a question like, how is there not an annual March for Democracy that's larger than the March for Life? Like, is it not that important to us as Christians to live in a country that is small d democratic? I think it is. I think it has to be if we want to get things back on track. So that's how I'm trying to approach this question. It's small d democracy. And if you could rightly say in response to the question I just asked that that's a tall order, it's a fantasy. But I really think you have to ask yourself, what choice do we really have? At what point does the need for dedication to this issue become so great that we have to speak in those terms? And at that point, I think the faith comes in. That's sort of where I'm going. So when I talk about faith tonight, I am talking about it in a very general sense. I'm not talking about the Catholic faith. People use that term and they mean Nicene Creed, they mean sacraments, they mean preferential option for the poor, they mean all of our doctrines that we all grew up with. I don't really mean that. I think you can certainly get there through your own experience, but I'm using it in the way that Paul Tillich used it, faith as ultimate concern. And the reason for that is that's a definition that reaches across boundaries. And Paul Tillich is your first introduction to someone that we read in Professor Lamb. Paul Tillich is someone who fled Nazi Germany and is a Protestant theologian, and he was horrified by the fact that in his own home country, which had been filled with so many great Christians and religious people had made this choice really to make Hitler and the Nazi Party their ultimate concern, to make a race of people and a country and a government their ultimate concern. They had turned their backs on God in his view, and he wanted people outside of that situation who maybe believed a lot of different things about God, but at least still believed in God as their own ultimate concern. I think he wanted them to understand that they were all on the same side, and that this was a choice that all of us get to make, that faith is an inherent capacity that we all have, and you really can choose to put it in an earthly ruler or in a race or a group of people, or you can choose to put it in God. And when you make that latter choice, you're doing something special, whether you're Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish. So that's kind of the way in which I present this to my students, the way that I want to talk about it. It's important to me because I got deep into, a very secular, a very kind of ugly at times political world that was like very far from what the Sisters of St. Joseph would have taught me at St. Bernard's or even the great Christian Brothers. I don't think that my own Catholic formation really prepared me to live that life and make those kind of choices and deal with politics is full of ambiguities. It's not really a place for very pure moral judgments. And so to me, I still experienced faith along the way of that journey, but this was kind of more the way that I experienced it. Faith in a very general and a quiet way, like a very vague source of confidence. A source of confidence that I couldn't really explain. It's more of like the definition in the letter to the Hebrews. Faith as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. It was not seen, it was barely describable, but at times along the way it was there, and that it helped me a lot. So I'll start when I ran for Congress in 2018. It was a district that some of you still live in. I've talked to you before tonight. It was a district that Donald Trump won by 20 points in the 2016 election. It had Waynesburg and Greensburg both in it, parts of a bunch of difficult counties, and it was thought of as being impossible to win. Our party, the Democratic Party, didn't even have a candidate there the previous time in 2016, and so, for some reason, I wanted to run for it, and I had a job that I really loved in the Department of Justice, and you couldn't run for it and keep that job. You had to walk away from it. So that was a big decision of mine, and I remember talking to my parents about it at one point. And my dad used a word I've never heard him use in any other context. I didn't even know he knew this word. He just said, "Conor, I think that would be Sisyphean." That's what he said, Sisyphean. I've never forgotten it, I didn't have to look it up exactly, but I was like, wow, that's a reference, Dad. But I didn't in any other situation in my life. I think that would have knocked me back a little bit. But for some reason, I just had this feeling that the people who lived there were just people, that Donald Trump didn't own them, that the label of, their red voters were blue voters, that those were just media things. I just had that feeling, and I had no empirical case for it. When I started calling people to ask them to donate to my campaign or support my campaign, I had nothing I could say that would convince them I had a realistic shot to win this kind of thing. I just, really, if anything, the facts were against me. The more I drove around that district, people still had their Trump signs in their yard from the 2016 election. Like, it was not really looking promising that they were going to be making a change. But the confidence that I had was there. And this is a quick tangent, but I just think it has to be said, because there are probably some people in this room who can relate to it, which is that to be both a Catholic and a Democrat in the years 2018 to 2026 is, that can be a confusing experience in its own right. Just 1 or 2 generations ago, the people that formed me, the people that I learned everything from, the Catholic Church and the Democratic Party were almost hand in glove. And I came up in kind of the remnants of that world. And there was very little ambiguity about either one back then. But all of a sudden, I have to say it because she's here. I won't point it out to her. But when I was first nominated for Congress, it was at this convention in a high school gym in Washington County. There were 554 people who got to vote on whether I was going to be the nominee for that special election. And so kind of my whole life hung in the balance at that point. I had just left my job a couple weeks ahead of time, and I had to get that nomination to be able to go forward. So we're in the gym, and the votes were cast on these little pieces of paper, and they turned them all in, and the people are at this table counting them. And I'm standing there, and I'm trying to watch what's going on, and it felt like it was silent to me, and a little sound of like something plastic hitting the gym floor kind of skitters across, and I look over, and my mom had been clutching her rosary beads so hard that she broke them, which I've never seen that, But what I mean is kind of like that's my world. There's nothing unusual about that at a Democratic event, but not everyone felt that way. So, along the way, you realize that your loyalty to both of these things gives you a strange place in each of them. And I remember it was up here in the North Hills somewhere, some priest came up to me at a fish fry to make sure I knew that he would deny me communion if I ever came into his church, and similar things would happen like that in politics, of being sort of a heretic from the other direction. That only has to happen a couple times before you start feeling like kind of a stranger in your own house. But I say all that to say that there's sort of a lucky aspect to it, which is that the situation of this first campaign that I ran, this was an enormous asset, because just so happens people all over this district felt that way. They were Catholics, and they were either sort of the last holdouts of, conservative Democrats, or they were former Democrats, but they could relate to it. And so whatever that weird confidence that I had to go for this, it kind of matched with their experience and their expectation about how someone could talk to them. And it made it so other people who couldn't see where I was going, these people, I think, did see it. So against the odds, we did win that campaign. And all along the way, I would kind of have these moments of what the Jesuits called consolation, that sort of feeling that comes over you after an experience that is just reassuring and validating. It's supposed to kind of tell you something about what God wants for you. One happened actually the day that I was sworn into Congress, so we're talking April of 2018. And I had to give a speech on the House floor, on being sworn in. And it's kind of my first real speech, real something substantive. And I wanted it to be a real thing. I didn't want to just go down there and say, God, thanks everybody for supporting me. I'm so excited to be here. I wanted to say something meaningful because I thought I had been through a really meaningful experience. And I wanted to say something about that our democracy was still alive. That what I had experienced was if you go everywhere, if you talk to everyone, if you take every question, if you invite everyone in, there's still something to this. People still believe in it out there. They still believe in our institutions. People are not red and blue in their souls, all that stuff that you've all probably heard me say, 100 times. And so, I knew that there were all these people that had supported me and they'd be watching at home on C-SPAN and stuff. And I just, more than any other speech, I think I felt a lot of pressure about that one. And so I was a little afraid of how was I going to do? The House chamber is a big room. And so I went walking that day to clear my head, and I ended up just south of Capitol Hill. There's a church called St. Vincent de Paul, one of the many Catholic churches around the Capitol. And I just, it's one of those feelings where you're like, I better mark this occasion with a prayer or something. And I just walked in. And on the table, they had these prayer cards, which I wouldn't ordinarily be a guy that picks one of those up, but they were just right there. And I picked it up, and it was just kind of one of those moments in your life, where I look at it and it just says, do not be afraid. Don't be afraid to give a big speech. For behold, I proclaim to you good news of great joy. I'm even getting choked up for it now. The all people part, it was like there was so much in our culture is that you're only talking to one group at a time. And I had kind of staked my project on the idea that we would try to talk to more people than that. And so, I still have it 8 years later. I took that picture for tonight. And I just thought, someone was trying to help me out in that moment. And they did. And, I got through the speech, it was fine. But when I think about it now, that was what faith was for me at that time. It was like these just sort of quiet, subtle reminders, almost a pat on the back, like, you're on the right track, kid, keep going. So unfortunately, I think the man upstairs might have given me one too many of those, because I got pretty confident and I got elected to Congress 2 more times and was doing well, and for good reasons wanted to kind of go a little further and see if I could do more. So in 2021, I decided to run for the Senate, as a lot of you know, against, God, what was his name again? He's so easily, he slips the tongue. It was the only time I've run against someone who was taller than me, so that is an issue. But it's a big jump up, at least in the way I experienced it. I think running for the Senate versus the House is like going from the college to the pros. I mean, it's just a bigger project. And I was starting from behind, kind of. I knew that, he was a little more popular than I was. And so, that was the hardest year I've ever had, just physically, mentally. I'm traveling all over the state to try to meet people. And then, unfortunately, the way we do politics in this country, I'm traveling all around the country, begging for people for money. I'm going out to Silicon Valley, and I'm going to Texas, and I'm going to Tennessee, and I'm going to LA, and all these places where you're like, why are you going there if you want to represent Pennsylvania? And so on top of all that, I'm trying to get back to Washington, D.C. to vote in the House of Representatives. I didn't want to miss votes. And so it's very rare that I get home and see my wife and my son, who's, turning 1 during that campaign. So it's just tough. You just don't feel like you're doing anything particularly well. And I wasn't even doing the Senate campaign well. I mean, so you're not a great father, you're not a great husband, really not a great candidate at that point. So not doing a lot legislatively since you're so distracted on other grounds. So it was just it was a difficult year for that reason. At one point, I remember, I guess it was the springtime, I was on my way home after really, I think I had been on the road for almost 4 straight weeks since I had been back. And I'm on my way home, and my wife calls to tell me that she and our baby had tested positive for COVID. And I'm just like, oh, and it seems silly now. Like, I stayed in the basement that entire weekend. I talked to them through a glass door. Like, I remember seeing him, lean his cheek up against the door, and I'm like, no, I've got to stay healthy so I can get out there and campaign, and I just look back on that stuff and think, what was I doing? But that was what that year of my life was like. So by now you know the end of the story, of course. There were a lot of articles like this one, kind of premature obituaries to my career. I lost by about 30 points, so almost had them. Right there at the end, we were really, if we could just another week maybe. And, every year, plenty of ambitious politicians lose. It happens all the time. There's nothing extraordinary about it. And I'm not telling you all this because I want some kind of extra sympathy for it. What I'm trying to do, I guess, is get going a conversation about what it means for us all, ordinary people, to make the choice to involve ourselves in the democracy versus all the other things that we could do. We all could do good things for people. I'm sure all of you do good things for people with your churches and with these other groups. You don't really have to end up like this. But that was the question I found myself wrestling with afterward, to go through all this and sort of lose it all. And the thing is about politics is it's not really like sports where you can get back up and there's like another game the next week. It's kind of like getting thrown out of the league, at least in this situation. I mean, there was really nothing else I could run for or channel my energy into. And so I'm sitting around a lot thinking, was this actually even my calling? Should I be doing something more that's not going to lead to this? And I think, I don't want to say a lot about Fetterman specifically in this talk, but I will say this one thing, which is that I think losing to him for someone like me was additionally tough because he has a manner of presentation and an attitude and kind of a history that it's just a rejection of a lot of the things that I stand for and a lot of things that I've learned about how to do this. And so, to lose like that to him, the way that it really felt was that I felt like not only was I discredited, I have a name, and I felt like my name was somewhat discredited by all this. Because the way that the discussion went after this was such a high-profile race and a high-profile victory for him that it became, my name, our name sort of became this thing about being ineffectual and corporate and, all the things that they talk about. And that was a name that was not only my own. It was something that people in my family had built up for a long period of time, most of them not politicians, most of them trying to do good things in the world. And so when you're the carrier of something like that, it's very easy to, feel the responsibility of that and then feel like you let them all down. And I think that is kind of how I felt for a long time after that. You may have heard, I heard this from a Catholic priest, so you're allowed to say it, I think, which is that there was a guy who passed away and was expecting to kind of walk up to St. Peter and the pearly gates, but when he kind of came to in the afterlife, the person who introduced himself to him was Satan. And he said, I'm going to take you on a tour around here. It's not as bad as everyone says, let me show you. And so he walked him around and he said, oh, what's that over there? And he said, oh, well, actually many of the finest philosophers are down here, and that's Aristotle over there. And he's having it out with Nietzsche, and people come and they listen to these talks, and then they heard some music as they're walking along, and he's actually said many of the finest composers, some you would be surprised about, they're down here, and they put on these free concerts, and they come to past this, there's this food thing, and there's amazing smells, and he's like, the best chefs you could ever, the Italians, all these people, they're here. So it really is not, it doesn't deserve the reputation it has. And he gets to the kind of the end of this lane, and he can see over sort of in the distance some flames and some smoke on the horizon, and he's starting to hear these faint yells and all this stuff. And he says, "Well, what's that over there?" And he goes, "Oh, those are the Catholics. They insist on that. That's for them." So that was that was sort of what I did to myself in the wake of all this, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So this is all that I have, though, to tell you about. These are sort of my raw materials. And so to get back to the Jesuit terms again, this period for me there was no consolation. It was all desolation, if you know the opposite term. And I think I had a hard time sort of letting my faith break through then in a way that would address all this, because the way I framed it in my own mind was that everything that had happened up to that point was a gift to me. Getting elected to Congress at such a young age, and giving that speech. If you'd have told me when I was 20 years old that I was going to give a speech on the floor of the House of Representatives when I was 33, I would have said, life complete, like dream come true. And so to me, that is just that was an incredible gift, and the chance to represent all these people and do all these things. And so I had myself sort of convinced that I had thrown that away. And I think that's what made it tough for me to allow things to kind of break through. So when I started to develop my class at Duquesne, I think I was trying to break through that. I was trying to think, like, what is there deep down that can just sort of point me in the right direction again, or help me figure out, is there even a connection between this kind of faith that I feel and I want to feel and democracy, or should I be going in a different direction? And coincidentally, that same first year when I was working on the course, I got invited to a wedding in Denmark, of all places. And so I started reading about the country, and of course, as one does, I learned very quickly about Kierkegaard, who used to take all these walks through Copenhagen. I went and found his statue when I ultimately got there. And so, while my wife was looking up all the Michelin-starred restaurants and everything that there are in Copenhagen, I was reading Kierkegaard, trying to just get a feel. Who is this guy? He's an important figure. I was never a big philosophy person. Justice Rehnquist said one time that when he read philosophy, he felt like he ended up walking out the same door that he went into, and that was how I felt about it, basically. So, but I just started reading about him, and I have no idea why, but when I got there, I would ask these people in bookstores, you got any Kierkegaard, and a lot of them said no, no one here has read him for decades, but I found one, and I started reading him there as well, and I learned something, which is that the secular idiom that we all use of a leap of faith comes really from him. He didn't use that exact term, but that concept is something that he developed in a book called Fear and Trembling. And it's about the idea, his idea was that life occurs in these stages. And what he really hated the idea that people thought that just kind of getting up and going to the established church every Sunday was living the Christian life. He hated that. That was what he was rebelling against. And he thought that life was this challenge to try to make yourself kind of progress or advance into these different stages. And he thought that you had to take these drastic leaps in order to get there, irrational leaps. And his text in Fear and Trembling is all about Abraham having to sacrifice his son, Isaac. Just like a horrible story, maybe one of the worst things in the Bible to try to struggle with, God wants me to murder my own son? It's not an easy thing to make sense of. And to him, it was not so much about, just sort of submission no matter what. It was about the choice to abandon it all, and just kind of leap into the unknown. And that to him is what faith was. So, I don't know. This is one of those things that just started working on me over time. And one day it kind of dawned on me that if there was one person in the world that would look at my sort of desolation or my facts and circumstances and say, you know what, you did exactly the right thing, it would be this guy. I think old Kierkegaard would say, you're finally starting to learn something now that you've lost. That's maybe what you needed. Because to him it was the leap. It's not, did you achieve this and make, your family proud? Is are you progressing from House to Senate or from this job to that job? It was more actually about kind of getting out of that mentality and just trying to do the thing that you really are called to do, even if you fail. So that was kind of a big moment for me in trying to understand, letting go of that result and just thinking about, why did I do all this in the first place? Like, why was I putting so much energy into politics and government in particular? And he couldn't really address that. He lived in a monarchy, and he was in the 19th century and all this stuff. But he was a huge influence on someone that could help me a little bit, and you all know who that is. And I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into everything that we cover in the course with Dr. King, but the one thing that I think is just really important, and that I make my students read and then listen to and then talk about and listen to again, is this one sermon that he has called But If Not. And you can find it on YouTube. It's like 23 minutes long. If I was allowed to prescribe one thing to all Americans, like instead of following Robert F. Kennedy's advice for health and wellness, I would say just listen to But If Not maybe once a week or twice a week until you get it. And this is a sermon where he talks about a King Nebuchadnezzar, who he's trying to force everybody to bow down to this golden idol. And there's 3 of the Jewish leaders who say, we're not doing it. And he summons them to him, and he's trying to scare them and everything, and he wants to throw them into this fiery furnace. And they basically say, look, we know that our God could deliver us from your fiery furnace. But if not, if he chooses not to and we burn up in there, we're still not going to bow. That's just how it is. And, King is giving this speech to his followers in 1967, which you would think would be a time where he'd be proud of everything that they had achieved. They'd gotten the Civil Rights Act by that point. They'd gotten the Voting Rights Act. But he, talking about turning outward and making these leaps of faith, he just kept going outside the South, and he was all over the northern cities at that point, and the FBI's tailing him, and he's seeing how entrenched racism and poverty are, and that they're not going to be fixed by a couple pieces of legislation. And there's a lot of historical evidence that he's feeling like a real failure. I mean, he's drinking, like he's having a hard time. And when you listen to this sermon, you can hear him almost trying to convince himself as much as anybody else. But he's just the one who made that connection for me. I mean, you can do all sorts of good things in life, but taking on hard political fights, especially on behalf of the vulnerable, people that do not have a voice, that is a worthy enterprise, and that is something that requires real faith. He called it though faith as opposed to if faith. If faith is basically if things go well, if you continue to win, if you continue to find prayer cards right after you got elected to Congress, then it's really easy to say you have faith. But though though things go badly, you still kind of persevere through them. So this was what I think, for me, just allowed me to kind of cast everything differently in my own mind. And I'm going to kind of skip what might have been the most interesting part to you, but I'm running out of time here. So January 6th was a big time for me. I don't want to overly emphasize that. Let's talk about democracy. I've done a lot on faith. Let's talk about democracy for a second. So you have maybe seen this quote from Winston Churchill before. I present this to my students a lot because I think that it does, in a way, capture a common view of democracy, which is that it is like a technology. It is a thing that we shouldn't expect too much of. It really is just a way that we're going to run society and try to keep the peace, and we shouldn't have high aspirations for it. I don't think a lot of people mean that when they say today that our democracy is breaking down, that we have to protect our democracy. I think really what many of you are talking about is our way of life. Our traditions, our heritage. How did we get to be this way as a country? What are we proud of? I think that's what people mean by democracy. The person on the right is E.B. White, who you would know obviously from Charlotte's Web. And I discovered this when I was getting ready for my course. In the middle of World War II, the War Department had sent out a prompt for writers to address this very question: what is democracy? And they wanted to kind of tell that to the people as part of the war effort. And so E.B. White has maybe the classic response to that of all time that I'll just read quickly. It is the line that forms on the right. It is the don't and don't shove. It is the hole in the stuffed shirt through which the sawdust slowly trickles, the dent in the high hat. Democracy is the recurrent suspicion that more than half of the people are right more than half the time. It's the feeling of privacy in the voting booths, the feeling of communion in the libraries, the feeling of vitality everywhere. Democracy is the letter to the editor. Democracy is the score at the beginning of the ninth. It's an idea which hasn't been disproved yet, a song the words of which have not gone bad. Democracy is a request from a war board in the middle of the morning, in the middle of a war, wanting to know what democracy is. So that's another one. Print it out, put it on your refrigerator. It's motivating. But I think he gets at something that I want my students to take away, which is this idea that democracy lives and breathes. It's not words on a piece of paper. It's not a technology. So the founders believe that. That's something we cover quickly. I'm just going to run through that. But this, if you've never seen it, is what Benjamin Franklin wanted the Great Seal of the United States to look like. It says rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. So if any of you are going to any protests lately and you need a good slogan for your sign, maybe you could use that one. But a lot of them thought of the founding of this country like the Israelites fleeing the land of Egypt. So Thomas Jefferson did not take up his advice to use that, but in the actual Great Seal that you can find on your currency, it does say Annuit Cheptis, which is he favors our undertaking. They were very careful to always keep the Christian images in there. If you think that's too old, this is another one of those just great moments in my life. Around the time, all the same time I'm talking about, I was working on a legal case with an older guy who had grown up in the West End in the same neighborhood as my grandfather. And he loved that connection, and he went home and he had a yearbook from my grandfather's senior year at St. James, which is the Catholic school in the West End. And it had all these great pictures in it and stuff. And he sent me text message images of the whole yearbook. And just buried within this yearbook is this woman, Annette Amen, class of 1940, wrote an incredible essay called Democracy is Christianity. This is an 18-year-old girl in the West End of Pittsburgh in 1940. And I know you can't really see it, but the things that she wrote in here, I just, so close are democracy and Christianity in spirit that they unite in America's refrain. Fundamentally, they are the same. Democracy is based on the rights of the individual. Each person is privileged to use the rights of democracy as long as he does not infringe. By stating that democracy and Christianity are synonymous, it's not meant that democracy is religious, but that democracy is based on the same principles as Christianity. She just goes on, and the eloquence of it is like, I don't think we would see this in most high schools in 2026. I don't think people are taking this for granted. And the reason that I want to have this conversation is what is the road back to where, people that share the same faith as so many of us would just take something like this for granted and understand that democracy and Christianity they grow from the same soil, is sometimes the way that I put it to my students. So from here, I'm just going to give you a very, very quick overview of a couple of the other things that we cover. Really bonus points to anyone in here who is obscure enough to recognize the great scholar Robert Bellah. We read a lot about him because I think he is the one person who really tried to chart the kind of cultural disintegration that takes us from this to where we are today and what happened in America in between. One of the things he does say, though, is he kind of is one of the people who teaches you that when the framers, or the founders were creating this country, they were not framing a structure or a document. They weren't just passing laws. They were trying to influence the kind of people that we would become. They were trying to make our politics an expression of the whole way of life of who we were. And if you can kind of internalize that, it's a little easier to see how the faith that they might have had, in setting up this democracy sort of should be extended through time. It took for granted, really, the idea that we were all going to be people of faith too. Thomas Jefferson had this crazy belief that everybody was going to become a Unitarian. No offense to any Unitarians that were here. He thought by the time he died, actually, all of America would be Unitarian, and they would just fully fuse their politics and their religion. But that's not what happened. Traditional biblical Christianity is kind of what dominated in the early republic. And the great challenge to that, which we go through with the students, is the Civil War, because you had biblical Christians on both sides, obviously. So it was not the great restraining force that they all thought that it would be. But Lincoln is really the most important figure in the class, because he's the one person who, he was obviously able to do things that were very difficult and required a lot of decisive action. But he is someone who just always, always, always acknowledged his doubts, the paradoxes of the situation that he was in, the biases in his own judgment. And if you go back sometime and you look at the second inaugural the way I do with my students, he does this whole build-up about both sides, reading the same Bible and praying to the same God, and just sort of ends with this statement, the Almighty has his own purposes. And there's a famous Protestant theologian that really analyzed Lincoln later in the World War II years. He's trying to resuscitate some of this way of thinking. And he said that even though Lincoln was kind of known not to be a passionate member of any one religious congregation, and there were people throughout his career that dogged him as not believing in God, even though he did, he had kind of his own way about it. This guy, Reinhold Niebuhr, said that he thought that Lincoln's religiosity was actually superior to not only most of the politicians of his time, but most of the religious leaders themselves. And it was precisely because he was able to resist the natural temptation to do what all political leaders, indeed all men, have done through the ages: identify providence with the cause to which he was committed. And there is just so much certainty in politics today. I think it's weird, like as someone that lived through it, you can look at social media and you're just like, how are you so sure about that? How the conviction that people claim to have in things, and it's sort of hard to imagine us having a prominent political leader who's willing, after his side they're about to vanquish the Confederates at the point he gives this speech, and rather than say, God is on our side, we will win this war, because God has honored the sacrifices of your sons and daughters, it's not what he does. It's just not what he does. He says the Almighty has his own purposes. So the very last point, I promise, from the course is that we actually spend more time on the Lincoln of the 1850s than we do on Lincoln the president. After all, that's Lincoln the losing Senate candidate, and sort of small time former House member. So there's just a natural affinity. But if you really want to think about tough issues of democracy, his debates with Douglas are the best possible way to do that. Speaking of defining democracy, the prompt that E.B. White did so well on, Lincoln had an even simpler definition of it, which is this. He didn't talk about democracy a lot. They were talking more about republic and that kind of thing, but this was his definition of democracy: as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. And it seems simple, but hidden within that is actually something very profound, which is that Douglas basically believed that a group of people with a majority could do whatever they wanted. And that the big debate was about what was going to happen with slavery in the territories. And Douglas said, if people in Nebraska or whatever place want to vote to have slavery, they should be allowed to do it. The original colonists threw off the yoke of the British who were trying to control them from far away. How would we let Washington, D.C. control what happens in the West? And Lincoln basically, was willing to say there are some things that you just don't do. And, what I talked to the students about is he didn't just go on social media and say that. He didn't just write it down. He took this very strong stand, and he wasn't an abolitionist, but he was willing to go out and campaign among, the sort of white working class of his day and say that, slavery is not going to add up to anything good for you either. And if we allow a system in which this is going to spread and grow, it is a cancer that will eat everything that we believe. It'll affect you. It'll affect your freedom. And he was talking about sort of a mutuality to people in America long before that was cool. And he was willing to do it on the campaign trail, where he then lost. So when you talk about the example for me, I guess, of him, of King, of people like that, is this choice to look outward, to risk things, to risk a reputation and all the things that come with, political involvement for both of them. Obviously, it ended their lives. But that was a way that they were living out the Christian faith. That was the way that they decided to do it. Lincoln thought that really what Christianity was about, what democracy was about, was willing freedom for other people. He believed in obligation. He believed that basically you had to go out and tell people that they have obligations to each other, not just promise them that things will be okay if you elect me and do what I want. There's an echo of Václav Havel for those who know about the synthesis of Christianity and democracy that he developed. He said somewhat tongue-in-cheek in the United States that he loved seeing our Statue of Liberty in New York, and he thought that we should have a statue of responsibility on the West Coast to counteract it, because you can't have a democracy like this without that sense of obligation. So I've exhausted my time. I have many more yarns I could share, but I want to make sure people are allowed to ask questions. I'll just close this part by saying what I'm trying to do is not, lay out a 5-point program. I'm not trying to talk about legislation. What I'm trying to do is make this a conversation that's normal for people of faith to have. Not just a conversation about policies and issues, but a conversation of, are we going to turn outward and take responsibility for the democracy in which we all live? And there's a lot of people in this room, on this call, who have a nice enough life that you don't have to be here, you don't have to worry about these problems, and it's the Liam Ramoses that pay for it at the end of the day, right? But you're here because your faith tells you that the lives of these people, not just their abstract rights, but their real lives, they matter to all of us. And I think you all know that, but I don't think I would be wrong in saying that there's an absence of that kind of discussion, at least in our formal religious spaces. The idea of us all marching together for democracy every year the way we're supposed to march for life, I guess, it almost seems ridiculous, but it shouldn't. And I think if we can at least accomplish that by talking about these kind of issues, we'll have done something, and it might allow us to move forward. So thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. And for those who are online, so for those of you who are in the room, you can see there are 2 microphones. So you could, if you have a question, you can come up here. If you are not able to come up to the microphone, we can bring it back to you. For those of you who are online, look for the reactions. Under the reactions icon in Zoom, there's a raise your hand feature, and I can see Jim Ruck and Jim McCarville, and they will let me know when there is a question online. So, do we have anyone who has a question so far? Okay, we have one in the room.
Is there any prayer, do I need to say my name or I'm Sharon.
I think
so.
Palantir already has it, so don't worry about it. Yeah.
So as I think about faith and things that we learn from Scripture and the present time we find ourselves in, I think about re-looking at the Old Testament and how so much more often there were leaders that were disappointing to God. Way more often, the leaders were disappointing. And we, of a certain age, I was born and raised and continue to live in this little miracle time for somebody who presents to the world like I do, real stability my whole life. And that's really unusual. But not to me. And I also, even if I wasn't quite old enough, I am now old enough, and I was at points old enough to learn that I could demonstrate. People demonstrated and changed history with a war, with civil rights, with women's rights, with bad government in Watergate, and have our system work to make things different. And my thought process now is that we are on a downward spiral, and we won't see the bottom of that spiral in my lifetime. That's a real possibility. That I think, wow, that's a real possibility. And so we're called to lessen the blow and the hurt of the most disenfranchised people in that descent. And I feel that I am called to have a will to hope for the future that I will never see. You know, we're planting seeds that we won't see the likelihood of. So what are your thoughts on how we fortify ourselves in that regard?
Sure. You know, here's something that we talk about in the class that I think is relevant. There's all these people writing now in the last 10 or 20 years. Have people heard of the book The Benedict Option? It's like a really good example of this. A conservative guy who's become sort of orthodox, and he basically wants people to form these tight, religiously orthodox communities and just kind of live in fortress Christianity no matter what happens around you, kind of batten down the hatches and almost be like one of those monasteries in the Dark Ages that is going to preserve the light of knowledge and tradition and et cetera. And maybe, again, the Almighty has his own purposes. Maybe God does want a certain number of people to do that for some reason. But the idea of in any way trying to fortify ourselves by closing the boundaries, to me, is kind of the opposite spirit of what democracy is really about. So the pain of it all, which you're expressing, this idea of disintegration, of things getting worse, of it being harder on other people than you've had, that's just part of it. And again, I think that, I think old Kierkegaard would say, I think I would definitely say now, having been through it, it is the leap that matters. I think every time you're willing to get out there and take some sort of action on behalf of these people that you'll probably never even meet. I mean, talk about an irrational move, to go and kneel on a sidewalk or a roadway in front of an ICE agent who was probably recruited specifically because he has the poor judgment to attack someone like you in a moment like that. You're not doing that on behalf of yourself. You know that. You're doing that on behalf of a lot of people that you're never going to meet, and on behalf of a whole system of the rule of law that we want to try to preserve. And that can only come from, something that is so irrational that it can lead to these kind of difficult circumstances. But that's the only way I can think to answer it, which is that democracy itself doesn't really contain some obligation or reason for us to act like that. I do think we have to tap into our deeper sense of faith. And what I'm trying to say, I really ran through it, but the founders knew that from the very beginning. They kind of knew that they weren't giving us an instruction book to be great citizens and people of virtuous character. They were counting on the churches and the religious tradition to do that. And of course, now, I skipped through the January 6th stuff, but let's be honest, a lot of Christian churches are forming people in the very opposite way. I mean, I was there. I can't tell you how many people were speaking in tongues and holding up crosses and talking about Jesus right outside of the Capitol right before they all invaded it, And so I think it makes it doubly hard, where you want to turn to your faith as a source of strength to do these things, and you see people saying the exact same things or calling on the same symbols for the opposite, and that's the mystery of faith right there. So
there's an online question.
Well, you pulled up a slide, of course, of Martin Luther King, Dr. King, and he was somebody who was very clearly, totally motivated by his faith, and believed that his faith required him to take really big risks to support oppressed people and to stand up for what was right. That included, incidentally, a year before he was killed, in this one of his really important speeches, when he came out and said that the war in Vietnam was wrong. And many of his colleagues in the civil rights movement didn't think that was a smart thing to do. But at any rate, I do believe that our faith calls us uh, to stand up and be counted and to take risks. Right now, we're confronted with a very real possibility. I mean, in many ways, we live in a fascist state now, but it's not clear that the fascists are going to win. But I do believe we're going to be called upon to go further in totally nonviolent resistance to the kinds of things that this administration is trying to do. And so, yeah, so my question is, what do you think are the kinds of initiatives we should be willing to take, or what do you think are the kind of risk we should be prepared to take based on our faith uh, and our concern for our fellow citizens and all the people around the world who are suffering so terribly because of what's happening?
Right. Well, Bruce, you've put your finger on something important, which is that, like a true politician, I have evaded specifics up to this point, or anything that would be troublemaking. That's actually for a reason, though. So first of all, your immediate question and the immediate issues that I know are occupying everyone's minds in here. Great risks are going to have to be taken. I think what I was trying to express from my own experience is that, the way I ultimately came around to seeing it was the part of it in which maybe my faith felt the furthest away, or where I was hardest on myself and felt the worst. When I look back, that's actually the part that I was proudest of. That was a miserable year. It was a tough experience. I kind of did throw away something that I was given. Like, I probably should have cherished that office a little bit more. But I know, and especially after January 6th, I knew that I just really felt like that was the right direction and the right risk for me to take at that time. Applied to the year 2026, for all of us, we're trying to figure out how to engage, what risks to take. I guess all I can say is that it may not feel good at all until several years from now, when they invite you here to give a speech about what you did and how you got arrested and tear gassed by ICE and all those kind of things. So that's all immediate. But what I'm trying to really get at in this course, and if any of you, are part of groups where you think, I could give a similar talk pared down with a little more practice, I think we have to find a way to reach out of just, we are liberal people of faith, and look at the great example of Dr. King, and he's telling us to protest. Obviously, we have to do all that, but we have to have a society where we can talk to other Christians who don't want to protest and may not be as horrified about the other things that they're seeing right now. America's not going to be a one-party state in the other direction, from the left. I hate to break that to you, but we are always going to be engaging, Republicans, Democrats together. A lot of people out there living in the suburbs are not going to look at it the same way as us. And our only chance, I think, like St. Paul at the Areopagus, is to try to think about how some of these symbols, are not only motivations for immediate liberal sort of small L, small d political action, but can they be some form of common ground that we can try to build with people, as hard as that may be to believe. And that's what I'm talking about. Like, every one of you deep down, I think, probably doubts if that's a project worth undertaking. You probably doubt that the Christian churches I'm talking about want to hear from us at all, want to engage with us at all. All I can say there is I am the one who, went to the gun shows and the Rotary clubs and all these places, and nobody chased me out, nobody threw anything at me or was mean to me. There is a possibility of dialogue in this country still, and I think that, tapping into this common ground that we do have in common it's the one way we have. It's the one way I can think of. So,
just wondering, the young people in your classes who are our future, how do they respond to what you're teaching them?
Thank you. Yeah, that actually is kind of the perfect follow-up to what I was just saying, because it really is true that a lot of younger people are more conservative than you might expect, especially the men. And it makes it a really interesting class because they come at the material very willingly. There's a lot of interest in religion right now among, these people in their 20s, at least the kinds that are at Duquesne Law School. and they kind of get that things are off track and that maybe religious involvement is a way to have a more stable life. And they have these sort of conservative impulses that were formed against what they perceived as woke culture when a lot of them were in college. A lot of them were in high school and college for sort of those days and then the pandemic. But they are not owned by like the MAGA movement at all. They are really interested in this stuff. But they just, they could never picture themselves at a protest. That's not their DNA. Their DNA is like they want to join a church and maybe have a family, kind of on the younger side and live this like sort of faithful. It's almost like a program for them, like influencers are influencing them to kind of follow a certain path. But it opens a door. A lot of them would have never listened to something like the But If Not sermon by Dr. King, and I tell them about how, as a member of Congress and a candidate, I've traveled to all these black churches, and I've heard stuff like this in real life, and how powerful it is, and the way those congregations are Christian congregations too, and they live out their faith through politics and through taking care of people, and you can kind of see lights go off. So that's what gives me the confidence to stand up here and say, like, there is a possibility for us to reach across some of these divides, I think. So.
There was a question back here.
There is, but I understand you have to come to the microphone, so the masses of the 300 can also hear it.
We'll go you, and then we'll take an online one.
I'm very interested, you've talked about our relationship with those of others' faiths, but I would be very interested for you to talk about those who have no faith and how we build those.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, first of all, I think like Bob Dylan did, that you got to serve somebody. I think that was sort of what Tillich was trying to say with that definition of faith as ultimate concern is people are actually putting their ultimate concern somewhere. Many of them are not calling it religious faith or thinking about God in express terms because they might have grown up in a place where to them God was like an old man with flowing white hair and big muscles and all this kind of stuff, and it's just not what they identify with. But faith, at least with my students, faith to them is a feeling, it's an internal conviction, a call, and it doesn't have to have a specific source, but it's a way that you can get into this conversation of, what is sort of a higher vision for our life and our conduct. Where does that come from? It's not just self-interest. It's not just self-advancement. There's something more to it, and it kind of matches with what's happening in America writ large. So you may have heard of like the nuns, not the great nuns of Divine Providence, but the NONESs, the people who answer religious surveys, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, none. They answer none, but they are not atheists. Like you, research has been done, very well studied. They're not rejecting God. They don't have no faith. They have faith in something more abstract, which you may also look at as, they're waiting for someone to kind of come along and put this feeling of faith that they have, but they're not sure what to do with it, sort of realize it or articulate it. And I think that's what, I can't claim to be making religious converts out of any of these students, but you can see lights go off where they realize, I think this is important. I think this about our democracy important, and here's why I think that. And they're able to start. A lot of them are people who grew up with a religious background and left it, and they're trying to think about now, how much do I want to go back to it? And that's a big category of people in our country. So,
Conor, it's been very interesting to me that a lot of the questions have been around leaps of faith, and but yet I see faith as hijacked by religion kind of doesn't encourage that very much. And how do we overcome that short of the traditional ways, which are coming out of a foxhole, or devastation, crises? How do we get at that?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the fact that religion itself, Christianity itself, is part of what has to be revived in this country. Like, it's not the same as it was, and it just has to be said that there is a big part of Christianity right now that is leading us on the road to ruin. That's a difficult conversation to have, cuts very much against the common ground that I'm trying to build. But I know from my experience that there is a big group that is not sort of firmly in that camp. Like anything else, there sort of are extremes. And a big part of what we look at, when I have the full 13 weeks, not like tonight, is the way that, belonging itself has just crumbled in America. And if you know the Bowling Alone thesis from the 1990s, Bob Putnam is still alive, and he sort of updated that for the New York Times last year and talked about how it has kind of gotten worse. He saw a lot of it coming, but he thought the most destructive thing was television. Imagine if that was your view, and now you see, all these years of social media, and then God only knows what AI is going to do to us. When I am talking about how we find a way to kind of get upstream of some of these problems, it is finding ways of belonging. Like, it is getting 200 people to come to a room in the middle of winter. So really the Association of Pittsburgh Priests probably could give us a better answer to this than I could. But that's what I would like to do with young people, is just find some way to get them in rooms like this, contemplating these issues, where even if they don't leave wanting to join a religious congregation, at least there has been some calling out of their faith in this very concrete way that we need, which is for people to sort of take responsibility over the democracy that we've been given.
Professor Lamb, thank
Hello.
you.
Hello.
I really appreciate your candor and your vulnerability tonight. I felt my hackles raise when you showed the essay from the girl in the 1940s about the connection between Christianity and democracy, because I was hearing something of a unique connection between Christianity and democracy, or an exclusive connection between Christianity and democracy. And I was curious what you have learned, perhaps from your students or from your colleagues and friends, about the connection that followers of other world religions have with the idea of democracy, and if there's some particular examples of that you might raise.
Yeah, sure. I think that we'll quickly get out over my intellectual skis in that conversation, so I want to be careful. The relevance of that yearbook essay to me is simply this, that it was so accepted by what seems to be an average, good student at a Catholic high school that democracy and Christianity were completely like this. I just think that is so interesting that at that time it wouldn't even be questioned, contra my experience now. I will say, there's a lot of people now who are writing about the Christian roots of our ideas of democracy and human rights. And again, to go to my friend St. Paul, there are people claiming, that scholars saying, really his statement that there is no Jew nor Greek, there is no slave or free, is one of the first times you can think of where this idea of universal rights across boundaries is being extended. That's kind of the important one to me. I'm not enough of a scholar of world religions to know, like, how does that statement of universality in Christianity compare to what was happening elsewhere? I do know, we talk about Athenian democracy and the Greeks sort of originating democracy. That really has no universal basis. It has this kind of story behind it about, Athena and a particular piece of land that was Athens, and they thought of the people of Athens as almost like arising from the earth of Athens, like trees in an orchard or something, and that was what gave them the status ultimately of democratic citizens. Was not any sort of idea as much as a very biological family way of belonging. So the democracy that the founders here were reaching for, drew more on Rome and more on their Christian beliefs than it did that. So that's about all I can say, I think. Yeah.
We have time for, I think, one more. And a quick follow-up. Very short.
I have as much time as you guys want. I'm not trying to rush anyone. Yeah, so.
I would just like your impression, I'm afraid I may not be very articulate in expressing this. Congress is essentially split, give or take, 50-50. All those people, I assume, went to do good and to do the best they can. We have a leader that has a little bit of controversy in some of the things he does. Being as kind as I can. Why are people so reluctant to oppose things that are obviously wrong?
Yeah, no, it's the question of the moment in a lot of ways. I think we forget to ask it enough. My own experience of it was like a lot of politicians are basically lazy, and Donald Trump still is far more popular in their own districts and states than they are, and now that his supporters own all the platforms. He has his own platform. I mean, the things he's doing now are just so many orders of magnitude more powerful than anything they can do to make their voice heard. A lot of them feel that their safety and lives are at risk when they go against him. Even if it's just their offices, after January 6th, there were 10 members of the House of Representatives that voted to impeach him for January 6th. We thought that thing was kind of a layup, right? I mean, obviously, but no, only 10. And of those 10, only 2 came back to the U.S. Congress. He drummed out the other 8. The senators who voted to convict, 7 of them, believe it or not, which is an amazing fact that I don't think people appreciate enough. He has systematically gone after those senators. So really, he has just taken over their party. And there were people there, even when I was there, who had the courage to vote against him or speak up against him. And they're mostly gone. Okay? He mostly knocked them out. There's a few left. And they don't have the platform. We live in this algorithmic, platform age, and it's very, very hard. Tom Massey, bless his heart, I guess, breaks through every now and then from the Republican side against Trump, but they're going to try do their best to drum him out too. Look, there are times I look back now and I wonder if I should have taken a stance maybe against my own party once or more times than I did, and I was kind of known for that. But you do have this soul searching of like, did I speak up for my constituents in my district every time that I possibly could, or did I fall into that rut of doing what the party wants? There's a lot of pressure on you when you're there, so I sympathize with it. But I just think some of these people, they have to think about what their legacy is going to look like. I mean, I was worried about what my son would think of me for losing one election. Imagine if your kids and your grandkids, are going to read that, wow, America, people were being sent to gulags in El Salvador. You were cheering it on. I mean, they didn't just turn the other way on that one. There were Republicans going down there and filming videos about how great it was. I mean, that's the level that we've gotten to. So I can't really make much of an excuse for that. But in all things, there is, Art he kind of gave the best synopsis of these points that I could even give in my speech before we started. And when he said, many are called and most are frozen, or whatever he said, that's what a lot of people are, both in Congress and in the public. They aren't really actively. They're not the ones going down to El Salvador, and some of them can be brought over.
Okay, Jim has one more.
Last question, a good way to close the evening, and you don't have to really answer it, but people online want to know, when will they have the pleasure of being able to knock on doors again for you?
Well, yeah. I don't know. I'm not hiding anything. It's a different decision, obviously, when you have 3 kids versus 0, which I had the first time. What I will say is, I really mean it. If any of you are part of other groups, I know you all do synodal stuff and are in other congregation and other groups in the community. If you have any other groups that you think would be interested in something like this and you want to find me, you can find my work email online. Send me a note like, hey, a little less Kierkegaard, a little more Lincoln, whatever you think. I'd be happy to do that. I think, at least what I'm trying to make as a contribution right now is we have to get people talking about this. Like, it shouldn't really be that unusual for people of faith to be talking about, hey, we've got problems in our democracy. We've got to fix them. That is a natural expression of our faith. And I just, when I was trying to put together this course, I kept Googling the terms faith and democracy together, and there's not a natural great set of materials on this. So I think if we can talk more about it, we'll get somewhere. So thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
So first of all, I'd like to invite you to join us on Zoom on March 3rd, where we will have Alan Story joining us from Africa. And then on April 6th, we will have Patty DeMarco. Also, this will be another one right here, and on the topic of preserving the living earth. And for those of you who would like to support our speaker series financially, you can go to www.associationofpittsburghpriests.com, and you can also go there to find many resources such as our previous speakers, and this recording will be there as well. And then finally, we would like to invite you to a retreat that will happen on May 2nd. There will and our own Art McDonald will be here, and that promises to be a wonderful retreat. I think that will be good for you to come on Saturday, May 2nd. So look for those details. And then finally, we have a closing prayer. So Patrick, Clary Burns, do you want to open or close us with the final prayer?
With what shall we come before our God? God has told us, women and men, what is good and what our God requires: to act justly, to love kindly, and to walk humbly with our God. From Micah 6. And from Anthony DeMello, peace is only found in yes. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much again to Conor Lamb. We're so honored to have you here today, and thank you for sharing. All right.